Who would leave a submarine lying around? You would hope that the answer to that question would be nobody, but it seems that it might be everybody. There are discarded submarines all over the world, some of which have more interesting backstories than others. We're focusing only on the interesting ones in this video, so let's waste no time and dive right into it. Our first submarine is known by two names. You can call her K-77 or Project 651. Either way, she's a Juliet-class Soviet submarine, and she once served in the Soviet Navy. The story of K-77 began in January 1963, when she laid down in Gorky. The Soviet Union was never exactly big on telling people what their submarines were up to, so we're not sure what she did for the majority of her career. It's probably safe to assume that she spent most of her time following U.S. Navy aircraft carriers around. What little documentation can be obtained suggests that she was retired from service in 1994, which is a little unusual as the records also suggest she was decommissioned 3 years earlier. The vessel later found international fame after it was acquired by a film crew and used as the set for the 2002 Harrison Ford and Liam Neeson movie K-19, The Widowmaker. She was scheduled to become a museum after filming wrapped, but she sank after a heavy storm in April 2007 and is currently thought to be too badly damaged to be worth retrieving. She's likely to be scrapped. If we were to ask you to think about the Japanese reaching or attacking the American mainland during the Second World War, you'd almost certainly think of Pearl Harbor. That's understandable, but it wasn't the only piece of the US mainland the Japanese reached during the war. They also made it to Alaska, and they left this midget submarine behind as proof. The Japanese Navy landed on Kiska Island in June 1942 and occupied it for a full year before being driven off it in July 1943. They were in quite a hurry to get away by then, so they didn't get the chance to pick up all of their equipment. This submarine was left behind, which was a bad move, as it allowed the Allies their first detailed look at the technology behind it. Japanese midget submarines were both an annoyance and a danger to Allied navies during the war, because they were fast, agile, and hard to detect at less than 80 feet long. Despite the cramped conditions inside, which are apparent even from these images of the rotting abandoned sub, operating the sub required 2 men inside it to work in tandem. That would be a bad assignment for anyone with claustrophobia. The French submarine Rubis had quite a varied service life during the Second World War. It started off with the French Submarine Pavilion, but then became part of the Free French Naval Forces before ending up back with the French Navy. Its exploits as part of the Free French Naval Forces are legendary and too numerous to mention here, but Charles de Gaulle saw fit to award the boat with an honor called the Ordre de la Libération in October 1941. The award was generally reserved only for soldiers, but the Rubis was seen as being worthy of special recognition. The mine-laying submarine is credited with sinking 22 German ships during the war, 14 of which were warships. Rubis remained in service after the war, but was struck in an accident in October 1949, which led to her retirement. She was subsequently sunk to be used as a sonar target in 1958. The wreck of the Rubis is close to Saint-Tropez, which is one of the world's most expensive and desirable holiday destinations. She's gone on to become a popular attraction for the region's wealthy divers. The German submarine U-711 might be the unluckiest shipwreck of the Second World War. She was a Type 7C U-boat and was launched in June 1942. The vessel had a comparatively quiet war, attacking and sinking just 2 ships and causing extensive damage to a third. Her most notable success was against a British corvette called HMS Bluebell in February 1945, which she sank with an acoustic homing torpedo. The Brits got their revenge on May 4th that year, just days before the German surrender. U-711 was struck and sunk during an air raid carried out by the British Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm as part of Operation Juggernaut, which was an attack on vessels anchored at Kilbotn in Norway. The target was the MS Blackwatch, but the U-711 was moored alongside the Blackwatch and caught 4 missiles that were intended for it. The captain ordered her to sail away, but the damage was already done, and the U-711 went down. It was the very last air raid carried out in Europe as part of the war. The only saving grace is that the crew managed to escape with their lives. We've all heard the famous song Yellow Submarine by the Beatles, but did you know that there's a real yellow submarine stranded in the waters of Coney Island Creek in New York City, USA? The forgotten vessel, which can still just about be identified as yellow despite a thick coating of orange rust, is the Questor 1. The 45-foot-long submarine was built in Brooklyn in 1967 by one man working alone. Jerry Bianco made his ship from salvaged metal and intended to use it to salvage valuables from the wreck of the SS Andrea Doria, an Italian passenger liner that sank close to Nantucket Sound 11 years earlier. He never even got the chance to try. The crane that was lowering the submarine into the water slipped, and Questor 1 fell sideways into a mudbank and got stuck. Bianco attempted to refill the ballast and refloat the Questor, but he couldn't free it, and eventually he was forced to abandon his creation. The ship stayed in the mud until 1981, when it broke free and drifted away. You can still see the top of it on a clear day when the tide is low. The HMS Holland 1 was the very first submarine that the British Navy ever commissioned. It's surprising that they didn't give it a more appropriate name like the HMS Britain, but nevertheless, she was the first in a batch of 6 that went on to be known as Holland-class submarines. She still exists today, but she went missing for a very long time in the middle of her life. The Holland was ordered in the year 1900 and launched the following year, but didn't begin sea trials until April 1902, as Britain wanted to keep her existence a secret. The Holland spent most of her life performing tests and trials before being retired in 1913. Amazingly, she was decommissioned and sold without any of her fixtures and fittings being removed. Even her torpedo tube was still functional at the time of her sale. She sank while being towed to the scrapyard after being sold, but was raised by a team of volunteers in 1982. She's now on display at the Royal Navy Submarine Museum in Gosport and has even appeared on a postage stamp in the United Kingdom. The U-352 is a Type 7C German U-boat, 220 feet long and 20 feet wide. It was built in 1940 in Flensburg as part of the ill-fated German war effort. The U-boat had a fairly uneventful military career until May 1942, when it became the first German U-boat to be sunk by the United States Coast Guard. The vessel was close to the American East Coast during the time, and was sunk by the U.S. CGC Icarus as part of the Battle of the Atlantic. The wreck of the U-352 can be found just south of Cape Hatteras in calm, warm Gulf Stream water, which makes it one of the most popular wreck sites for the area's many divers. The vessel is mostly in one piece and has developed an entire marine ecosystem. The hull of the U-boat is encrusted with algae and has been noted to support sea anemones and a variety of corals. So many amberjack and red barbier baitfish swim around the wreck that it's sometimes difficult to obtain clear photographs of it. Experts say that the wreck is in a stable condition and might survive for several centuries, barring accidents. The HMS Alliance Submarine Museum in Gosport, England, isn't so much a submarine museum about the HMS Alliance as a submarine museum made of the HMS Alliance. The Second World War was already over when the Alliance launched in July 1945, but she still had an impressive career with the Royal Navy. She remained in service for almost 40 years before being retired in 1981, at which point it was decided she'd be scuttled to become a museum ship. We tend to think of submarines as small, cramped vessels, but the Alliance is a 300-foot-long behemoth with 10 torpedo tubes, mine-laying facilities, and external guns. She could remain submerged for up to 30 days at a time, which was unprecedented back then. It looked like the Alliance might have reached the end of its useful life in 2013 when decades of saltwater exposure almost rusted away the bottom of the ship. But after being closed for renovations, the HMS Alliance is now open to the public once more. According to those responsible for her care, she's as good as new. Submarines make better museums than you'd probably imagine them to. As further proof of that, here's the Abau Submarine Museum in Lima, Peru. It's another retired submarine, and when it opened its doors to the public for the first time, it became the first floating museum in South America. To give this boat her full name, she's the BAP Abau SS-42, and by the time she retired from active service in 1998, she'd been with the Peruvian Navy for 48 years. Most of the inner workings of the Abau were left in situ when the vessel was decommissioned, so tourists are invited to push, pull, and prod at whatever levers and dials they wish when they climb aboard. Be warned, though, this submarine is significantly smaller than the HMS Alliance. While that ship was built to provide comfort for British sailors on long trips to the Far East, the Abau was built for practicality. It's narrow, it's cramped, and it's surprisingly dark in places, even with the lights on. Your visit won't necessarily be comfortable, but it will give you an appreciation for the brave people who served aboard her beneath the waves for weeks at a time. The Oberon-class submarine is associated with the Royal Australian Navy, but most submarines of the class were actually built in Scotland. The HMAS Atway was one of the first 4 Oberon-class submarines ever ordered. She laid down in Greenock in June 1965 and launched in November 1966, eventually going on to be formally commissioned in April 1968. She made it to Australian waters for the first time in September of that year. Her life in service was long, but almost entirely uneventful. One could argue that the most interesting thing that ever happened to her was that she suffered a damaged fin when she collided with a whale in 1971, although she did rescue the crew of a ketch called the One and All after it ran aground in October of that year. After decommissioning in February 1994, she was sold for scrappage, but the town of Holbrook in New South Wales, Australia, decided to buy her fin and upper casing despite there being no direct tie between the submarine and the town. What's left of the Atway is, therefore, now visible outside the Holbrook Submarine Museum. The HMAS Ovens followed hot on the heels of the HMAS Atway. She was built by the same shipbuilders in Greenock, Scotland, and belonged to the same class. Rather than being one of a batch of 4 Oberon-class submarines, though, the HMAS Ovens was one of a batch of 6. She laid down in June 1966 before launching in December 1967 and receiving her commission in April 1969. The life of the Ovens was altogether more exciting than the life of the Atway. The Ovens was the first Royal Australian Navy vessel to deploy as part of the Anzac, and also the first to fire a Mark 48 torpedo. During the Kangaroo II multinational war games exercise in 1976, the Ovens successfully attacked over 170,000 tons of shipping and sank the American aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. A broomstick was lashed to her attack periscope as she returned to Sydney Harbor as a symbol of her clean sweep during the simulated operations. She was finally decommissioned in December 1995 and was gifted to the Western Australian Museum, where she's been preserved as a museum ship. There's a submarine on display outside the Technical Museum in Zagreb, Croatia, that looks like it was built and placed on display yesterday. That's because of a long and careful process of restoration. The submarine is the former Yugoslav vessel Malisan, and it's been around since 1943. She's a CB-class midget submarine, and down with registration number CB-20 for the Italian Regia Marina. She never made it into service for her native country. The unfinished vessel was captured by the Germans after the Italian armistice of 1943, who handed it over to the breakaway Italian Social Republic, only for it to be captured again by the Yugoslav partisans and put into service with the JRM. After that flurry of excitement, her service life was surprisingly short. She was retired by 1956 and became the property of the museum in 1959. After that, she was essentially left to become derelict. It wasn't until 2008 that somebody thought it might be a good idea to show the Malisan some love, and by that point she'd been exposed to the elements for half a century. She received a full restoration of both her interior and exterior, part of which involved returning the vessel to its original Italian colors and designation. We suppose that means we should call her the CB-20, but Malisan seems to suit her better. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!